Hello everybody, Dr. Dave here. Welcome to Tipsy Vervet. The purpose of our podcast is to help people make sense of life and create meaning. Well, what we talk about is based on our own experiences with addiction and helping other people who are overcoming addiction. The principles that we share are universal, and we think they'll be helpful to anyone who aims to better understand themselves and who wants to cultivate a life that's worth living, regardless of what their past experiences might be.
I'm Pierre, and I've been involved in the addiction community for over a decade. This podcast is independent of any other work we do, and we're in no way affiliated with anyone else. We hope that the spirit that comes across in our conversations is one of compassion, and that you find it helpful.
Tipsy Vervet.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast. I'm here with my good friend David.
Hi, P.
What are we going to talk about today?
Well, you and I spend a lot of time in different rehabs, and we're led to believe that, in drug rehabs, on both sides, I've been on both sides of the fence.
So have I.
Yeah. So, and we spend a lot of time talking to people and listening to them and them listening to us. And what we find is, and I've always found this quite remarkable, is that we assume that coming off drugs and alcohol is always very difficult because of the withdrawal symptoms, and it can be. And when we experience withdrawal symptoms, especially when we're at home, they are so uncomfortable, it makes it almost impossible to stop. But when people join a rehabilitation center where there are no substances available and they are getting support, in fact, within a few days, people are very comfortable. And I would find this quite surprising, because you'd think when you're talking to somebody who's only been abstinent for 3 or 4 days after years of drinking, that they would be very jittery and uncomfortable and feel ill and not be able to concentrate. And in fact, that's not what we find. What we do find is in different environments, the response to becoming abstinent is different. And in a drug rehabilitation center where there is nothing available to use, and there is support, and there is an expectation of support and getting better, people are actually they do really well, actually. And one of the reasons why I love the rehab environment is because it gives people an opportunity to experience what it's like to be abstinent. And there's that saying, if you believe you can or you believe you can't, you're right. And of course, it's complete nonsense. Of course, sometimes you just don't know whether you can do something or not. And sometimes things seem really daunting and you don't believe you can do it. But when you try, with help, with support, and with someone to teach you and practice and getting into it slowly and learning the techniques, you find, in fact, you can do things that you didn't think you were able to do. And that includes stopping drinking and stopping taking drugs. And we've discussed this before, but one of the things that drugs and alcohol do when they boost dopamine in our brain, when you boost dopamine, you boost everything, right? But the thing that dopamine is really important in is learning. And so when we continually reinforce that this is a way I can cope with a difficult life, then it's a very powerful source of learning. And one of the symptoms of addiction is that I can't imagine what life will be like without drugs and alcohol. In fact, life without drugs and alcohol is scary. And so I very often, especially if I've tried before and not been successfully able to stay abstinent, I often feel like I can't do it. And it's not surprising, actually. In fact, it would be surprising if people felt that they could do it.
Right.
And so what happens is when they go into the rehab environment, it gives them an opportunity to experience abstinence and that they can do it. And so what I thought would be really helpful is to identify some of the things that are happening in a rehab environment that enables people to become abstinent and stay abstinent in comfort, without experiencing all of these symptoms. Because I often think, when I'm talking to people in rehab, they're very comfortable there listening to me, but if they went home and sat on their bed for half an hour, within that half an hour, they'd be popping down to the bottle store or phoning a dealer or whatever. And so something's happening in rehab that's enabling them to stay comfortable. So let's talk about that.
Sounds like a good idea. Before you jump in, what is your opinion on this idea of, I hear it often, you need to unlearn old behavior? We've had this conversation before, but won't you share with us?
Well, it's a common thing that people say, right? The point is, you can't unlearn something. What you need to do is you need to learn new behaviors to replace those things. And so one of the things that's associated with habitual drinking or habitual drug use is exactly that. It's a habit. And it's something I automatically reach out for impulsively when I'm feeling uncomfortable. And what makes me feel uncomfortable? Everything. So one of the things that I'm learning to do is, first of all, I'm learning that I can remain abstinent in comfort, that I can remain abstinent. And thirdly, I'm learning new habits to either add on to old habits such that the habits start to change, or to replace old habits. And that's one of the things that we do in rehab, right? One of the reasons why rehab is such a lovely opportunity to have is because you get to learn new habits and new skills that you weren't even aware of. Yeah.
Within a safe community.
In a safe community, with support and with a group of people who are learning with you.
Yes.
To a common goal, right? When we spend time in a community with like-minded people, and this is one of the reasons why the social groups work so well, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, is because the group has a very strong sense of identity. And what that means is the group is then secure. It's not threatened by outside things. Especially outside people coming in. So you can have people who are really dysfunctional coming into these groups, but very soon they can adapt to the identity of the group, take on this healthy identity. The other thing about these groups is the identity that they have is a very positive identity. When we're in active addiction or active alcoholism, we have a very negative sense of identity. I mean, we're judged very harshly by society, quite justifiably, and we judge ourselves in the same way. Whereas when we swap that for a new identity, which is a positive identity, as you call them, it's a group of overcomers. Yeah? So you swap that slave to circumstance, slave to drugs and alcohol for being an overcomer. Jakey wants to go out. Keep going. You swap a negative identity for a positive identity. So let's have a chat about some of the things that are happening in rehab. The first one, of course, is that there's no alcohol available, there's no drugs available. This is very, very important. And I often hear people say who are trying to grow into abstinence, become abstinent, stop drinking, basically, and stay not drinking, that if I can't stop drinking with it in the house, I won't be able to stop drinking. And it's true that if it's not in the house, you can go down and buy some. But it's a hell of a lot more effort than having it in the house.
Certainly.
If it's in the house, you'll drink it. It's as simple as that. Ultimately, sooner or later, you'll drink it. So don't have it available. The second thing that's happening there, so there's no, the point about not having it available is, in the rehab setting, is that you get to experience all of these emotions and feelings that have been so uncomfortable that we've dampened down with alcohol without being able to dampen them down. I often think one of the best definitions of recovery that we talk about between ourselves is recovery from alcoholism and addiction. And alcoholism, just addiction to alcohol, right? It's just a drug like anything else. The definition of recovery is learning to feel again and be okay with those feelings. They might not feel pleasant, but to be okay with those feelings without having to dampen them down with some sort of chemical and being able to respond to them. So part of that is to, of course, be able to identify what that feeling is, and we'll talk about that in another podcast. It's really important. I think a lot of the time, us as addicts, we operate on this level of emotion like this, and anything that takes us out of there, emotions that feel unpleasant, right? Sadness, anger, resentment, anxiety. That's when we automatically reach out and have a drink, right? But on the other hand, anything that takes us out of that feels good, happiness, excitement, for me, one of the biggest triggers that makes me think, geez, a drink would be nice right now is relief. Anything that takes us out on that spectrum too also feels uncomfortable. And so a lot of people say, when I'm miserable, I'm okay. It's when I'm happy that I relapse. And I think one of the reasons is because when they're here, they're more vigilant. They're feeling uncomfortable, they're more vigilant, right? Because you can identify when they're here, they lose that vigilance, but it's equally as uncomfortable as the other emotions. It takes us out of where we are. So one of the other things that's happening in rehab is it's a safe environment. We feel safe, first of all, physically safe, mentally safe, but also when we start to talk about our experiences, both with counselors and medical professional psychologists in particular, and in the group, we get a sense of a common bond. And one of the things certainly that happened for me the first time I sat down in group therapy, one of the big 3 symptoms of addiction, right? Hopelessness, anhedonia, and isolation. One of the big 3 symptoms of addiction, the third one, isolation. There's no one else in my world. No one else has had these thoughts. No one else has done these things. No one knows how I feel. It's like, you don't know what it's like to be me. That started to lift. Because you're in a group and you're talking about experiences that are so deeply personal. And often I can talk about things I'm deeply ashamed of. And what you find is that these are not unique experiences to you. That other people have shared them. And they've never spoken about them either. One of the things we do talk about in group therapy is intrusive thoughts. Now, most of the day, you don't choose your thoughts. They just arise. And some of these thoughts are deeply troubling. They're very often negative thoughts about ourselves, negative thoughts about other people. They're often thoughts about something that I could do, which I would never do because I think it's terribly wrong, but what does that say about me? And I think this is one of the reasons why we do feel a bit isolated from each other, is because we all have these thoughts. This is not unique to people who are using substances. Everybody has them. Some people relate to them a bit differently, perhaps, but we don't share them. And so these thoughts that I'm having that are deeply troubling tell me something about myself. They imply something about myself, and I start to judge myself because of them, which is understandable but not fair because I didn't choose them. I didn't think to think those thoughts. They just arise. And you think to yourself, well, they must have arisen from somewhere. What is it about me that this thought arises? And of course, it's nothing about you. That's how the brain works, and especially if we're using substances and we're suffering from depression and anxiety and things like that, and maybe sometimes even more serious mental disorders, then, these thoughts can be really, really troubling. So when we sit down in group therapy in a safe environment and we get to talk about these things and talk about our experiences, we realize that we're actually not so alone. And there's a sense of hope that starts to grow in this, right? Because now that I realize I'm not so alone, life has a completely different coloration. Yeah. So the third thing that's very, very important, and I think this is one of the most important things in a rehab, is that there's structure and routine. Now, this is really, really important because one of the things that human beings don't like is uncertainty. And in fact, that's one of the reasons we drink, right? To take away the anxiety of the uncertainty. Structure and routine reduces uncertainty because you know what to expect. The other thing about it is it reduces the decisions that you have to make during the day. And your brain is it's very similar to a muscle. You know, if you go to the gym and you do bicep curls, like when I'm doing bicep curls with a 60 kilogram dumbbell, I can only do about 20, right? And eventually my arm starts to get tired. It's exactly the same with the brain. The more decisions you have to make, you know yourself, you've had a busy day at work, you feel really exhausted at the end of the day. You haven't done anything necessarily physically demanding, but you've had to think, you've had to make decisions. Structure and routine reduce those decisions. When I go to the rehab, I always wear the same clothes. And I got this tip from David Attenborough. So I saw him doing an interview and somebody said to him, why do you always wear khaki pants and a blue shirt? And he said, because then I don't have to decide what to wear, you know. And I also find that really helpful. I know exactly what I'm going to put on before I go to see the people. And also, I mean, maybe it's also helpful for a bit of continuity and to maintain structure and routine, you know, not only for me, but for everybody else as well. That's a silly little thing, but it's, you know, I don't have to decide what to do. So structure and routine is very important. Also, what it does is in keeping you busy, and this is the other thing, that people are kept busy all day, right? Their whole day is planned from the moment they get out of bed to the moment they go to bed. There's free time and stuff like that, but the point is it's all planned in, but you know what to expect. There's no surprises. Your mind is kept busy, so there's less time for mind wandering. Do you remember we were in a rehab a couple of weeks ago, and somebody actually asked this question. They said, you know, what can I do to stop my mind from wandering? And I said to him, while you've been here, how often have you found your mind wandering? And he thought about it for a while and he said, actually, it hasn't. And that's because there's structure and routine and people are kept busy. So there's less time for mind wandering, there's less time for craving and rumination. The other thing about structure and routine that's really, really important is if you have routine, if you have habits, you don't need motivation because it's something that you're going to do habitually anyway, something that you do every day. I exercise every day. So often I don't really feel like doing it, but it's something I do every day. So in my mind, there's an expectation that I'm going to go and do it. So even in the face of not really wanting to, I don't feel like I really have to motivate myself to do it because I do it every day. And it's just a matter of not if, it's a matter of when, you know, what time. So less time for mind wandering, less need for motivation, and less uncertainty. Structure and routine, very, very important. So where we're going with all of this is, if this is working for us in rehab, this is what we have to do when we leave. And if you don't have an opportunity to go to rehab, if you're entering into sustained abstinence without that opportunity, then these are the things that you need to, as best you can, implement into your own life. So number 4, what we're doing is we are interrupting habitual behaviors. So we're interrupting. So for example, if I drink every day at 4 o'clock at home, I sit down in front of the TV or whatever, now I'm in a completely different environment. So I'm interrupting that environment and those habits and those patterns of behavior. And before I go to rehab, I might not even notice that I'm in those habits, right? Because they're habits, they're habitual behaviors. Whereas when I go and I change my environment, it breaks the pattern of those things, and it gives me the space to implement new patterns of behavior. I was listening to somebody the other day, what they were saying was that they needed to change some habits. So what they actually did is they just changed the furniture in their room, in their office. And just by changing the furniture around so that their office looked different, it just reminded them that something was new and that their behaviors were new. And so just changing the furniture around in their room enabled them to break the habits that they wanted to interrupt. And as we were talking about a bit earlier, it's not about unlearning habits. It's about learning new behaviors and substituting those. and making it as easy for yourself as possible to substitute those old habits with these new habits. And sometimes it may be adding to an old habit, right? So maybe I still sit down in front of the TV at 4 o'clock, but maybe now I eat. And when I eat, I don't really feel like drinking afterwards. So adding to that, call that habit stacking, right? Stacking new habits onto old habits. Number 5, very, very importantly, there are boundaries and rules and accountability. So when you avail yourself, in AA, they always talk about jails, institutions, and death. I always remind people in the rehab, they're in the institution, right? So you've got to avoid the other two. You're already in the institution. And it's a wonderful place to be. A wonderful place to be. Having the privilege of going to a rehab center to help you to stop using is a wonderful, beautiful turn that your life can take. But if you avail yourself to somebody else's institution, then you need to stick by the rules that they apply there, right? And there are rules in these places, and there are consequences for transgressing those rules. And you're accountable to your peers, and you're accountable to the counselors and the other staff. And again, one of the things that makes us feel secure, we're talking about uncertainty. People feel uncomfortable with uncertainty. One of the things that makes us feel secure actually is rules. We think that we all want freedom, and freedom is an absence of rules, but that's not true. You are free to get in your car and to drive anywhere in the country that you want. But it's the rules of the road that make that drive safe. So rules are very important, and accountability. The other thing we're doing in rehab is you're performing small tasks and completing things. And again, it gives you a sense of being a whole human being and small episodes of accomplishment. One of the things that is important in life is to do the little things. It's important to wash up, to maintain your own hygiene, to wash your own car, to do your washing, to do the ironing. These are the little things that give life meaning. We often think they're tedious, but do these things for ourselves is so, so important. And very often what you find is when people abdicate these and hire people to do all of these things, I'm not saying that one shouldn't do that, but often it takes away some sort of sense of meaning out of life if you're not doing the everyday little things for yourself. So we've spoken about the connection that we get from group therapy and the talking. The other thing that comes with that sense of connection is the opportunity to support each other and help each other and to receive support from other people. And it's a lovely, lovely gift to give somebody else, to allow them to help you, and vice versa. Yeah. So we're very seldom alone, and again, leaves less time for mind wandering. One of the things that we do get from talking with each other and talking candidly about our thoughts and our feelings and our experiences is that I'm allowed to be myself. I don't have to put on a mask or a false front to myself. In other words, I can be authentic. I can be, when I'm talking about authentic, because authenticity is often interpreted that I heard someone say the other day, this was advice they gave. They said, always be yourself. Don't change for anyone. And of course, what an appalling thing to say. It's just, sometimes we have to change, right? There are things about us that are not, there are thoughts and behaviors that are not helpful. They're not helpful for us or around us. And the thing about self-awareness, learning about myself, what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, what my beliefs are, what my biases and prejudices are, what motivates me, what my habits are, what I want out of life, is that I can identify what needs to change and areas where I need to grow. And that's the whole point of being in this lovely group of people where you can talk about these things authentically and realistically. So when I talk about authenticity, what I mean is not just doing whatever you want and being whatever you think you want to be. It's about being one person, right? Not being different things under different circumstances with different people. And sometimes different person with the same person but under different circumstances is incredibly confusing. And you can never be yourself. And one of the reasons that we do behave like that is because we feel ashamed we feel ashamed and we feel that we're going to experience shame. So we call it, I anticipate I'm going to experience shame if I'm not what this person wants me to be. So we call that anticipatory shame. And the three things that come from anticipatory shame, people who have this anticipatory shame experience, the first thing is I become very sensitive to rejection. And as a consequence of that, I become a people pleaser. And being a people pleaser, I can never be myself. I can never be authentic because I'm always trying to be what I think they want me to be. What they think, what I think they think, right? Second thing is that I avoid situations where I feel like I'm going to experience shame. So I become avoidant of social situations and doing things. And the third thing is I may become a perfectionist. And of course, we can't do everything perfectly. Some of us can't do anything perfectly, and that's absolutely okay, you know? So authenticity is really important. I get to experience authenticity and I get to learn how to be authentic. And very importantly, when we are authentic, when we are our true selves, we are at our most vulnerable. And so when we enter into a life of authenticity, we enter into a life of vulnerability, which is exactly where a human being should be, because that's how you grow. You can't do anything without making yourself vulnerable. You know, every time you do anything, there's a chance that it might not turn out the way you expected it to. It might turn out quite badly, actually. So you've got to make yourself vulnerable to do stuff. You've got to make yourself vulnerable to speak to people, to meet new people, to do things. So authenticity and vulnerability are extremely important, and they are learned. They are learned. Wonderful characteristics. We're also learning about addiction. We're learning about ourselves. As I said, we're developing this sense awareness, and there's a lovely sense of self-compassion that comes with this when I learned that actually I'm not just a useless drunk. I'm somebody who has been suffering from addiction. And I use that word on purpose because it's a terrible, terrible suffering. And there are reasons that I've entered into that lifestyle, and there are reasons why now it's time to emerge from it into enlightenment, into the light. Yeah. So very importantly, there's no tech. I'm away from distractions. I'm away from making comparisons of myself with other people on social media. I'm away from poisonous messages from the news, from talk radio, it's a calmer environment. I always say to people, stop watching the news. Stop watching the news. You can't do anything about most of it. And the little things that do affect you, you'll find out about those. But when you spend a lot of time watching the news and you spend a lot of time on social media, it will only bring you down. It will only bring you down. And I love your little exercise, right? Where if you want to see how something's affecting you, draw this line, right? 10 centimeters here. Before you do, this is the worst you've ever felt. And this is the best. And before you do something, put a cross on this line where you find yourself from a feeling point of view. And then when you've done what you're going to do, put another cross on this line. And if it's moved to the left, stop it, right? And you can do this before you do anything, before you sit down and use social media, before you sit down and you watch videos on the internet, before you sit down and you watch porn, before you sit down and you eat a meal or a type of food, before you sit down and you meet with somebody else, you can do this and you can determine how all of these things make you feel. And you need to be careful, right? Sometimes you need to get advice before you cut anything out of your life, and maybe not porn and eating lots of crappy foods, but it may be, that your experience with them you need to relate to that differently. So sometimes it's helpful to get advice before we cut things out. But you can, by doing this, you can be pretty sure, what things are good for you and what things make you feel unpleasant. Yeah. So no tech, no media, no news. Somebody once called me an ostrich because I told them I didn't watch the news. And we were having a meal together and they were ranting and raving about something they'd heard on the news earlier that day. And I said to him, well, he said, I can't believe you haven't heard it. So I said, well, I haven't listened to the news for about 7 or 8 years. And he called me an ostrich, ostrich, your head in the sand. And I said, well, who's enjoyed their lunch? So, yeah. Very similar to this, but much more carefully to be thought of and to talk through, is that we're away from relationships. And many of us have quite dysfunctional relationships. And we need to be very careful, right, when we reevaluate these relationships, because what we want to do is we actually want to get dysfunctional relationships out of our life. But you have to be very careful before you cut people out, because it might be you who's the dysfunctional one. So, the people who piss us off the most are often the people who love us the most. Our family, right? So just don't have one more. So, leave me alone, stop nagging me. But a lot of us are in abusive relationships. And sometimes some of us are in serially abusive relationships. We go from one abusive relationship to the other. And so what we've got to ask, and I don't think it's a simple issue, so I'm not criticizing and I'm not blaming, but one of the things we have to do is to say, what is it about me that keeps drawing me to these people who are abusing me? And it's very complicated. There are many personal issues that fuel that type of behavior. And so it's very simplistic to say to people, just leave them, just leave the relationship. But it is important to recognize it. And then I can ask for help of the people that I trust and get some advice. Because again, as I said, it might be me that's the dysfunctional one. And one of the things that a group does is they reflect back to me who I am. They help me to develop a sense of self-awareness and to learn who I am. And maybe I can identify some of these things, and then I can identify how this relationship's actually positive and how I'm the one who's sabotaging it. So being away from dysfunctional relationships and people with whom we're often fighting, or people who put us down or bring us down, is really helpful. And during this time, I can start to identify some of those and talk about them and get advice for them. Then the last thing about rehab, I'm sure there's other things that's going on there, but is that we get a chance to be of service. So we help people, we talk to people, we do cooking of some food, we do cleaning, we make our bed, we put out chairs when we're going to meet, we go and get coffee for somebody else. All these little acts of being of service give me a sense of self-worth and of value and of meaning. There is no thing, I don't believe, there's no thing in the world that will give you a sense of self-worth and meaning like knowing that you've made a difference to the life of another person.
Absolutely.
And there's an infinite ways that you can be of service in the tiniest little ways. There's a lovely book by Paul Kilo called The Manuscript Found in Accra. And it's about this wise elderly man talking to a village the evening before they're going into battle. And they're asking him questions and he's giving them advice. And the one boy who's too young to go to battle says, I feel useless because I can't fight tomorrow. I can't fight for my friends and my village, my community. And the old man said, nobody is useless. You never, ever know, in fact, when you might be or when you have been of use to somebody else. He said, you could be walking down the street and smile at somebody who's coming the other way, who's depressed and is actually thinking about ending it all. But your smile just gives them a small sense of hope to put that off, at least for today. And you don't even know that. And so we'll talk about this in much more detail when we talk about where to find meaning and how to make a life that's worth living with meaning. But to start to learn these things and to experience the sense of wholeness, the sense of accomplishment, the sense of community, the sense of camaraderie and being of value to other people. Yeah, it's a lovely experience.
Yes, it is. This topic came at a great time. A lot of the podcasts that I listened to recently have all had the topic or talked around the topic of imposter syndrome. And that's something that I've battled with my whole life. You know, even sitting here now with you, you know, I'm not a podcaster. What am I doing here in the studio? But going through the process that you described there in the rehab model, and I don't want to call it sequentially because I don't know that it's sequential for everybody. It certainly wasn't for me. I didn't do it in the order you just wrote it in. Well, I was obviously abstinent first, but gives you the opportunity to try all of the small aspects that we've spoken about today. And each of those in turn makes a change or starts to shift a perception or starts to make me consider that there are alternatives, look at things from a different perspective, perhaps for the first time in my case, for the first time in my life. And I don't know whether this feeling of imposter syndrome will ever go away. But that's no longer the issue, because what's changed is that I'm now empowered to know what to do with it.
What do you mean by imposter syndrome?
I often experience, I suppose the best way to put it is that I feel like a fraud. Feel like a fraud in the community. Sometimes, using the rehab example, we'll go to a rehab and it'll be my turn to talk, and I'll talk about whatever it was that the topic was for the night. And as soon as I'm finished, the first thought that comes into my head was, that was absolute garbage. No one's going to have derived any value from that. And I do experience that from time to time. But then we just need to start going around the circle and listening to the other people talk. And I can't think of a time where at least one person hasn't had a positive response or reaction to whatever the topic was that we spoke about. You know, so although I know it not to be true, especially in most of those instances, I can't change that I still experience it. However, it doesn't drive me to have to drink and use anymore. What it drives me to do is to contemplate and to consider. And most often the remedy for that is picking up the phone, call you, go for a cup of coffee, you know, see one another frequently.
Yeah, and it's more than a sense of being a fraud, in that it's being a sense that I'm a fraud and I'm going to be found out, that everyone else thinks I'm a fraud. I mean, imposter syndrome is very, very common. I mean, very common. And again, it comes back to this anticipatory shame, doesn't it?
That's exactly what I was about to say, is that it's guilt and shame that's completely misplaced because there's no event to warrant me feeling guilt or shame. But I've learned through my whole life of addiction that that is true in my mind because I never sought help and never spoke to anybody about the things that I felt. And so to get rid of that feeling, or let me rephrase that, to change the way that I respond to that feeling, took time. I loved what you said earlier. I don't think I've heard you calling that before, habit stacking. That's exactly how I've experienced it. I don't need to change that poor habit. I need to make subtle changes in order to develop a new habit. You know, and I suppose that, what is that, how does that work from a neural pathways or brain function point of view?
Well, I suppose everything's related to neural pathways, and so what you're doing is you're growing more new neural pathways, and you learn to do something. You learn a new habit by practicing, right? By repeating it over and over again. I mean, that's what a habit is. So nothing is a habit the first time you do it. It becomes a habit over a period of time with multiple repetitions. I wanted to come back to what you were talking about with this imposter syndrome, because I think it's really important, because so many of us feel like that. I mean, I'd be surprised if, unless you're a psychopath, most people feel like that, actually. Especially in some types of careers and things like when I started in medicine, even now I feel like an imposter. You know, it's made things for me to be extremely difficult throughout my life because I didn't feel like I was a real doctor when I was a doctor, and then when I stopped being a real doctor, I felt shame because I had left being a doctor behind and given up. and it's been very difficult, actually, for me. One of the things you said, and when you were talking about imposter syndrome, and you were talking about speaking at a meeting, and it's the same thing with the anticipatory shame. One of the ways to cope with it, of course, is to recognize it, and to recognize it for what it is. And for so many of the things we talk about, these symptoms, depression, anxiety, imposter syndrome, anticipatory shame, and guilt, the treatment for them is not to take them away, because for many of us, this is part of who we are. They're not going to disappear, but it's to change our relationship to those. This is very important, right? Because especially for things like depression, many of us operate on a low level of mood. Some people call that a constitutional depression. I don't like that because it's not a constitutional depression. It's a constitutional low mood. It means that we have to try a little bit harder not to dip down too far into major depression, and we have to try a little bit harder to, become enthusiastic and motivated and persevere with things. And it can be quite difficult. But the starting point for that is to recognize that that's me and it's okay. And this is the thing. What we do is we recognize these things and we learn to accept them. And what that means is that we don't try and push them away. The more we try and push them away, the more they fight back. It's like if you have an intrusive thought, which is shameful, right? The more you try not to think about that thought, the more it will push back. And you will fight your thoughts and they will fight back and they will always win. So you gave that example. When I started going to Alcoholics Anonymous, and at the end of a meeting, everyone gets an opportunity to comment on their experience about whatever's been spoken about. And I didn't. For the first couple of years, I never spoke. And after a while, I felt like I had something to contribute. And so I would say it. And when I was driving home, every single time I beat myself up. And it's, everyone knows you're an idiot. You shouldn't have said that. Now they're all thinking about it. It's incredibly narcissistic. It's so self-absorbed. And I just always felt intense shame. Sometimes it would last for days. And I think, I could never go back to that meeting. And then I'd think about what I'd said. And I thought, well, I wouldn't judge that badly. I still think it was quite sensible. So what I decided was that since I did feel like that, I would know that if I spoke at a meeting, I would feel like that, and to notice it, and to know that if I spoke, I would feel stupid afterwards. And I don't choose to feel stupid, but I will feel stupid, and that's okay. And so I just became okay with it. And when I spoke, I did feel stupid afterwards, but I knew I would. It didn't mean anything. It's just the way I respond to this anticipatory shame, right? And after a while of doing that, it went away.
Such a good remedy, but very helpful. I also recognize that it's easy for us to talk about these things because we've been practicing these principles and sharing them with other people at various institutions quite some time now. But I'm reminded how this wasn't an easy path. But I don't think I've embarked on a path that's been more worthwhile. And this is all these episodes that we're building up towards this idea of finding meaning. Each of these is a fundamental piece in this puzzle as we're going through it. And I think that the structure that we've put together for this is incredibly helpful in that respect.
Might be a good place to end.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for tuning in. As usual, we'll post a little bit of information in the bio below. And we'll see you same time, same place next week. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Steve.